Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first session of today's Design Talk program. We're here to talk about getting to grips with sustainability, a very important topic, as I'm sure you'll all agree. I won't do half as good a job of introducing our speakers as they will themselves, so I'm wondering if you could each just first of all introduce yourselves and perhaps say a little bit about what you do.
I'm Holly from DesignLSM. We are a studio specialising in interior design, strategy, branding and architecture for hospitality. We have been designing for the last 32 years, working with large-scale developments such as 9,000 square metre food halls, all the way through to entrepreneurial F&B boutique concepts, working with brands such as Hilton, Marriott, Galvin Brothers, Gaucho, etc.
Hi, I'm Nicola, Keenan, the co-founder and director of Boxx Creative. Like Holly, we focus on interiors, branding and strategy in the hospitality space. So our clients typically include restaurants, bars, cafes. We've done a boutique hotel and more recently a co-working space. The focus of our design is very much on the ethical side. So we consider the sustainable aspects and well-being. And this is very much the core of what we do.
And hi, I'm Anna Carneiro, and I own the brand and studio Be for Change, which focuses on homewares and accessories made out of upcycled materials. So I focus both on working with clients and designing products for them with what would be waste from their factory floors, and also our own brand products, in this case leather.
Great. So, I think we can all agree that sustainability is perhaps the defining issue of our time. And as the sense of urgency increases, it becomes more and more resonant, I think, for people. But to what degree do you think the design industry is just paying lip service to sustainability? And to what degree do you think there's actually a culture of change that is beginning to come to pass?
It's a bit of a funny issue because I feel like there are a lot of designers interested in really doing a good job and putting out really sustainable products, but there's a lot of confusion around what makes a product actually sustainable, which has lately resulted in a lot of things that those of us that maybe know a little bit more, have been in it for a little bit longer, look at, and it looks a lot like greenwashing. And I don't think that it always comes from a space of wanting to do that, as much as confusion as to what's the best way to go.
I think greenwashing. I think it's about trusted suppliers as well, and I think that's the thing from a studio's perspective, is that we work with a huge range of suppliers, and some will say, for example, that their timber is FSC, and then actually you look into kind of the production line and the supply chain, and you suddenly actually it's not quite as green or quite as sustainable as they actually add on. So I think it's, at the moment, the emphasis is very much on the studio or the designer doing the legwork, which we don't always have time to do, on top of tight timelines and clients wanting to open their restaurants, etc. So I think it is a key word, and it is something that clients definitely want to adhere to and look at and examine, but is it fully integrated into kind of the design process yet? Not as much probably as you would see in the food and beverage or the operational side of things.
I think, agreeing absolutely with what you both have said, I think it's very much as well driven by consumer demand. There's some companies that sustainability might be at their core and they've always done it. They might not just have shouted about it, or they're doing it anyway, but they're doing it behind the scenes. Because sometimes if they're doing some things, but not everything, they get picked up in the press. So they're very conscious of that. But a lot of people are being driven now by consumer demand. Consumers are becoming more conscious. Sustainability is becoming more widespread. So I think companies are responding to that, and some of the forward-thinking companies are realising that times are changing, legislation will change, and they're getting ready and preparing for the future and seeing what that will look like.
I think that issue of consumer demand is an interesting one. Do you think that a lot of the sustainability movement is being driven by the fact that consumers are actually expecting it as a par for the course approach?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're working on a food hall in Toronto, and we were going through the brand story and building that brand DNA for them, as well as the design, interior design. And this is not due to open for another 4 years. And so actually one of the CEOs said, I don't want to make sustainability a statement or a big thing within our brand story, because actually it would just be expectant. In 4 years, it shouldn't be a story. It should just be expected. That's what we're going to do. So I think I think it is very much driven from the consumers wanting things to be expected or wanting to attribute themselves to brands that are akin to their ethics. So I do think that's very prevalent. But I also think you see a lot more entrepreneurial food and beverage concepts being driven, and they are being driven through ethics and through kind of people's values, and kind of authenticity is a really big key word within concepts and design at the moment, and I think sustainability plays a big part of that.
Yeah, it's. I know that there's a lot of consumer demand, and I know that there's also a bit of confusion from the side of consumers, and people right now are very cautious. People who pay attention to sustainability, consumers who pay attention to sustainability are very cautious of what to buy. And I feel like there is a tendency to almost not buy unless you can be sure of the ethics behind the product. So I think that's something we need to talk about on the side of sustainability that goes hand in hand is being clear about what things are. Just having that openness about what materials you are using, where are they coming from, what's the product going to behave through its life, what's the lifespan of the product, what can be done at the end of its life. And more than ever, there's this expectation for the information to be clear and available, which, speaking for myself, is definitely a challenge, because when you are putting products in a shop per se, you don't necessarily have someone telling that story. So how do you communicate that without having to be wordy?
And then, of course, as a maker and as a product designer, I think people are often more able to get to grips with sustainability when it comes to the products we consume. But how much do you think people really care about sustainability when it comes to our design spaces, when it comes to interiors, for example?
Good question. I think with sustainability, it's coming very much from people's personal choice and their personal life first and foremost. And then it starts aligning with other aspects of their life, for example, the work that you're doing. And so for us, with the interior side, it's coming, say, with the products, and then it's the food. Then they start thinking, well, what are things made of? The restaurant I'm in, what am I sitting on? And that's where we're finding it's extending. So we're excited with what we do in the bars and restaurants, that people are becoming more conscious. Our clients are realising their designers are demanding that. So there's a real opportunity for us to make a difference and do something very quite special. So yeah, I think it's a really positive thing.
I think it's, as you said, it's heavily tied in at the moment with the food or with the ethos of the brand. But you look at things like Seosei in Scotland, in Penrith, that's just the first 100% vegan hotel that opens. Everything's vegan, from the bed linen to the food on your plate to the cleaning products that they used to clean the hotel. So I think you're starting to see more of those, and even big brands such as Hilton at Bankside with Bon Spa did their first vegan suite. So you know, and using things like Pinatex, kind of pineapple leather supplements, etc. To substitute 100% leather. So you are starting to see bigger brands becoming more attuned to using products within the actual design process. But again, I think it's how viable is that at the moment for smaller kind of concept creators, because of cost prohibiting and because of time and because of scale. So, you know, chairs, for example, whilst we can speak to our suppliers for furniture and we can get FSC and we can make sure that kind of they're as sustainable in terms of the materials or the glues or the whatever is used, it's still a bit of a battle to do it. It's still not the norm, and at the moment, very much when we have our suppliers come to talk to us, it's more about heroing products within the space rather than 100% sustainability of products.
And it's interesting that it's actually some of those larger brands leading the way to a certain extent. I mean, Hilton Bankside's a great example, because I'm good friends with Juliette Kinsman, who runs a company called Boutico, and so they actually brought on an outside consultancy firm specifically to address sustainability issues. And I know, Holly, as well, that you are working with Gaucho, and it's interesting that they are starting to embed sustainability as part of their story now, how they talk about the brand. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah, so obviously a well-loved, well-respected brand that's got a loyal customer base. So they're looking at the evolution of the brand, which launched late last year. So Charlotte Street was their first restaurant, and we worked with them about what was the design and brand evolution that they wanted to convey. And part of that story was about the sustainability, and they were very aware of the carbon effect that producing the beef creates, and also transporting it, etc. So they also started to look from a design perspective at where we could use more natural materials, more raw materials. Certainly the kind of dyes that we were using and the plaster walls we used instead of wallpaper, all the dyes were natural, made from natural minerals. And then we looked at the woods and making sure that we could reuse also. So looking at what they had in their estate that existed, what was on site that we could use. So making sure that if we didn't need to rip out wood, we could just treat it and repaint it, and using kind of ethical, non-toxic paints, then let's do that. And where else in the estate, if something didn't fit currently into the design, where else could they use it within the estate? So we were trying to kind of think of as many avenues that we could go down, rather than always just buying new. We could look at kind of recycling, and where we did need to buy new, how could we do that in a sustainable manner? Did you learn any lessons then, I guess, from that project that you think you'll be able to apply to other DesignLSM projects from a sustainability perspective? I think it's planning and getting in as early as you possibly can, getting that conversation in. So I'm sure, just like you, strategic kind of conversations are a key part of our process. So we always ask our clients at the beginning, and what are your key commercial, operational and brand objectives? And part of that conversation is what is sustainability, what is your environmental, what is your ethics around these topics, so we can understand that from the basis. So it is a bit harder when we're working with especially in central London, when we're working with kind of concepts that are going into spaces that are not their own building. So they have got to kind of compete with very expensive like rents, and landlords that might not be so kind of up on that issue, and they don't want their building to be retrofitted with expensive mechanical and electrical sustainable kind of elements. So for example, we're working with Bishopsgate, which is going to be the tallest London kind of tower block in London, or building in London, and they will be one of the first wellness standards buildings, so for all of their clients. So the sustainability from that issue was quite interesting, looking at kind of light and thermal kind of compounds of the glass, so that heating was brought down, and looking at all things like compressed air and water flushes. So actually it's 20% less water being used because they're compressing the air into the flush as well. So there's lots of technical things like that we're starting to look at, but I think for future projects it's about seeing if we can get in as early as possible to talk about that conversation, because it's easier and less expensive to retrofit than retrofitting. And then I think also it's about supply chain, making sure that we get our suppliers to come in and speak to our designers more and more and more, and pushing them to take the onus as well, so that they do a lot of the research and they can guarantee that supply chain is actually sustainable.
And with Boxx Creative, Nicola, you use the term consciously creating.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you can tell us what that term means to you and how you actually apply that to your work.
So Nicola and I, my business partner, is just over there. When we set up, we had a client project, and we realised that actually we were very excited. It was a coffee shop and roastery, and the heat from the roastery was actually going to warm the apartments above. And we were really excited by this, and we suddenly had the conversation, and we were like, oh, you care about this sort of stuff as well. So what we then did was got really clear on our values, and we realised that they were very much about creating, really caring about community and the environment, and collaborating, contributing and changing things for the better. So that then led us to come up with, well, how does that actually impact the design work we do, and what can we really do to improve things? And we came up with the term consciously creating, which really sort of worked for us. So it ensured that what we do is, as mentioned, it's the focus on the ethical, the social responsibility, the environmental side of what we do, and also the wellness, well-being side. And so from that, we then kind of, you go out there and you start telling people, and then you get client projects that are aligned with your values. So that's kind of how it all started.
And then can you talk about some projects perhaps that you've worked on where you've really embedded sustainability into them?
So one in particular, it's actually a vegan pizzeria called Purezza. We're working with them to redesign their interiors, and they're expanding. So the new one in Camden actually opens in a couple of weeks. So as it's a plant-based vegan pizzeria, we looked at how they can actually lower the impact of what they're doing. So we're reusing a lot of furniture from their existing sites, but we're also using recycled furniture, we're using recycled materials, we're repurposing lots of things and upcycling, and then looking at really the sort of the customers, and they're caring about the vegan side of food and the sustainability. So it's like we looked at the furniture and how that's actually manufactured to do that to vegan standards. So it's obviously got no sort of animal products in that, and we work with a specialist furniture maker to do that. But then we also looked at the sort of life cycle of things. Can things be repaired? Can the furniture, if things do change, can that be remanufactured? And so we really considered it from all angles. We also are doing a co-working environment. That's got more of a focus on sort of biophilia and well-being, so reconnecting to nature. But for us, it was an exciting opportunity to work with a lot of new suppliers. So sustainability very much started in the commercial office world due to a lot of companies having their corporate social responsibility. The flooring suppliers really pioneered the way using lots of recycled materials. So for us, able to work with suppliers from another industry who are sort of leading the charge, it's been a really sort of learning experience, and it's really opened up our sort of materials and network in that way.
And yet across the board, whether it's products or interiors, people can sometimes think of sustainability as a little bit of a headache, kind of more complicated, less convenient, more expensive. But it's interesting that with the likes of Gaucho, for example, they're using it as a way to tell a story about their business. So how can people make sustainability work for them so that it needn't be any of those things?
I think that it's really a lot about, as they said, thinking about the life cycle of the products and not always thinking about, just buying things new. So obviously there is nothing more sustainable than using what's already in existence. And that's an approach that I think it's becoming clearer and clearer for all of us that there's no such thing as waste if we want to be sustainable. We really need to think of waste to wonder. We need to think of how can we turn things that we currently consider to be valueless or of low value into things that have value. And not only is that sustainable, but that is extremely low budget. That's something that people have been doing for centuries, repurposing and taking things that, are, as they say, one man's trash is another man's treasure. And just having the creativity and apply that as a constraint to our project so that we can source things in unusual ways, if you will, that allow us to just work within the system without having to reinvent the system, if that makes sense.
I think it's also having those conversations, and going back to kind of have planning and having those conversations early, because you're right, you say to somebody whose just main goal is, I need to open this space in this time with this budget, that's it. And then you sort of say, well, okay, let's take a step back and realise, let's say for the food hall we're working on in Toronto, if we're planning the back of house space, let's plan, which we are doing, this generator that will actually turn your waste food into, it will compact it so it can be compostable. So you don't need the trucks to come in. So then your planning policy and your reaction with the community and your transport policy, so much better. Your costs are lower because you don't have all of this food waste being generated, and also the water that comes out of that waste is being used for your grey water, so your water bills go down. So suddenly there's a different way of looking at it. It's not, their main goal might not have been sustainability, their main goal might have been commercial because they have investors and stakeholders to answer to, but suddenly they could see the benefit of planning early sustainable methods because it gave them a win-win situation where their operating costs were lower. Actually, to implement these things at the beginning was lower than some of the ordinary kind of equipment they would use. And from a brand perspective, they were trading ethically and sustainably, which made kind of their message and their brand message much better.
I think one other thing to add that we found is actually, in addition to doing really good things and telling your client that, and they're very proud about that, it's actually the innovation. So we're finding the real innovation in design is actually on the sustainability side, because people are rethinking, they're changing the system, they're doing something different and creating something more unique. So when we're working with new materials, new products, new companies, we're actually educating the clients. And there's some really good things being done out there that are very different and forward-thinking.
And then I think Anna touched upon a good point when you said about the things built to last. I mean, in a forum like this, when we're talking about interiors and design and products, there's sometimes an inherent obsolescence, this idea that something needs to go out of fashion in order to create room for something new. In the hospitality space or in the interior space, do we need to start thinking about things with an engineered-in longevity? So instead of a restaurant that's designed to be relevant for maybe 4 years, perhaps actually it needs to have a longer lifespan, and that needs to be considered in the design of it as well.
I think it's interesting because you always get clients that will say, I want the Instagrammable moment, and suddenly there's an assumption that that Instagrammable moment has to be transient and it has to be plastic pink and fluffy and whatever, and something that isn't about kind of longevity. But I think actually we're certainly having more conversations with our clients which is about kind of the authenticity of what's within their scheme, so the longevity, kind of the circular products that we can put into their scheme, so it be, as you mentioned, it's something that can work for now but that can be repurposed either across their estate or repurposed into the kind of evolution of their concept. But it's, I think you've seen, well, I have seen in our studio a much more presence on people wanting craftsmanship and the tactile nature of materials. And as you walk around here today, everything's becoming much more tactile. It's becoming much more kind of, the experience as a whole is about all of the senses, and so touch and sight and smell and things like that. So I think that plays into that kind of authenticity, and that craftsmanship plays into working harder and looking and being more innovative about the products you use. And when you start doing that, you can bring that sustainability issue into the conversation as well.
I also think that a big part of this is flexibility in use. So we've seen as homes got smaller, especially in urban dwellings, and now we're seeing it a lot within other environments as well, that people expect a lot of our products to cater for more than one use. Things that we can put to service in many different ways. And I think that we're starting to see a little bit of that within interiors as well. Things that companies can shift around, and even environments that can be moved around to suit different needs, so that you don't necessarily need to have a room, a private room that caters for 20 people. You can have furniture that you can move to create that space and then move it back to open the space up again. And all of these different things that are coming into place are challenges as designers, but they're also really interesting because suddenly we're thinking about things that are more flexible, physically flexible in terms of materials, and also in terms of things just being modular and not necessarily in a 1950s way.
Spaces that are fit for multi-purpose today at 2 o'clock. So, Nicola.
I was just going to add, I think the other thing we consider about the longevity is very much about the end of life and the ability to repair it and reuse it. And particularly with hospitality, where you've got in hotels and restaurants massive churn rates, that's something we're really considering. So we did a lovely hotel project in Italy where the focus was about the legacy the hotel's going to have for guests and also for the local community, and it was about having that lasting as long as possible. So everything was manufactured locally, it's all repairable by the local workshop in the nearby village, and so it was all about reusing and the ability to repair and have that as a timeless piece, and really the longevity of the hotel rather than churn rate 6 to 10 years.
How much is it a problem that we're still talking about sustainability as a novelty and not just the assumed norm of how things should be done?
I think, from my personal opinion, and I'd be interested to hear, obviously, your guys' opinions, I think that's changing, but slowly changing, because I think it's becoming it's becoming more of a norm and less of a statement if you talk about the food and the food provenance. So in terms of talking about F&B concepts, I think operationally, so the plastics and the waste and the consumables, that's becoming less of a conversation. It's an assumption that no one gives out plastic straws now, or the kind of wrapping or the takeaway packaging is biodegradable, etc. But I think because of the slow or the more costly or the more difficult uptake it has been within the design environment, it still is a conversation that needs to happen, because I think we still need to push those suppliers, we still need to push the clients, we still need to kind of remember about it until it becomes more of a norm. Whereas I'm saying, I think it's if you Google sustainable restaurants, say for example now, it's all about the food and it's all about the consumables. It's not about the actual interior. So I think until it becomes about more that those products are more easily accessible, or suppliers, rather than boutique independents, kind of have more access, then I think it needs to be a bit more of a conversation so it becomes the norm.
I think that one of the things that's keeping at the moment sustainability as a bit of a novelty, not completely, because I do think that things are changing, but one of the things that's having a massive impact is back of house operations. Because at the moment there's just so much that happens behind closed doors that consumers don't necessarily see. And you can go to a high street shop and buy something that is made of 30% recycled material, and it seems to be for the most part sustainable, and you're not aware of all the plastic that's going on in the back of house, everything that was used to ship those products, and so on and so on. And there are a lot of issues up and down the line that we still need to look at more carefully, and there's definitely engineering problems within that. There's problems of materials that we don't yet quite have because they're either too expensive or not strong enough, or they don't necessarily match the regulations that we have in place. So there's definitely quite a bit of opportunities within that space, I would say, and I think that we're going to see a lot of innovation within that space in the next few years. But I think one of the things that's keeping sustainable design as a bit of a novelty is the fact that as much as we want to make everything sustainable, there's always some elements that are a little bit out of control at the moment.
And then actually to kind of carry on with that, I remember last season you telling me about the surplus of animal leather because everyone's shifting towards vegan leather. So we often see sustainability from our first point of contact with it, but how can people begin to think about the wider picture of sustainability so they're making genuinely sustainable choices, not just about that first point of contact?
I think it really comes down to the holistic picture and trying to take charge of as many aspects from the initial life of the product, from the moment of its creation to how is it going to be disposed of. And again, longevity is such a big word within this because, for example, when it comes to the leather issue, we have at the moment a lot of hides piling up because meat consumption has gone up worldwide, but down in some countries. A lot of these hides are being treated anyway because companies have an expectation of how much they are selling or going to sell based on previous year performance. And at the same time, we have customer demand massively changing and going for vegan leathers, which are most of them essentially plastic, which don't last even half as long, and which at end of life are toxic and there's no good way of disposing of them. So at the moment, there's just a whole lot of, I don't want to say, well, I'm going to say it, greenwashing around these issues because we want to do what's right and there is a consumer demand for certain things. And for example, there are certain aspects and certain words that carry a weight over from one industry to the other. So for example, when we talk about a vegan diet being more sustainable, that somehow carries over into other products. But we kind of all know that plastic per se isn't very sustainable. So why is it that vegan products are at the moment selling so well? Is it and are they truly vegan in the sense that they have caused no harm to any life form? You know, are they truly ethical in the way that they are being produced, and so on? I think that when we think of things more holistically, we tend to almost take a step back and we look at how things used to be done. And it opens a lot of doors. And as you were saying, projects in which we can see, you know, how is this going to be repaired and where is it going to be repaired and creating those conditions around. And one good thing that's coming out of this is that we're putting a focus on the human aspect of it because it's emphasizing human skill. It's emphasizing the ability to repair things. It's emphasizing the ability to reuse and rethink things. Which are very much human abilities and things that come up as invaluable in an age in which people are worried about jobs being taken away by machines when it comes to manufacturing, for example.
Yeah, really good points, Anna. And to add to that, when we were doing the vegan project, we had to obviously do a huge amount of research, and we realised that sustainability is very much, you open a can of worms, you think you're doing one good thing, and then you really have to look into that and see how everything is interconnected. Sustainability is not siloed. It's all interconnected, and so, you know, when we're looking at alternatives to leather, which is essentially a byproduct of the meat industry, it's recycled and reused, but vegan leather, a lot of them are just literally petrochemical, they're plastics, and that has huge emissions, huge water usage, huge chemical content, so it's not good for people necessarily or the planet. So you really then have to look into all of this and work out to make the right decision and do the right thing. It's not simple. So yeah, it can be a can of worms.
And then last question from me, and then we'll see if anyone in the audience has anything they'd like to ask. But as perhaps advice for other designers or makers, what are some of the baby steps that someone can take if they want to start a journey of being more sustainable?
I think it's looking at your supply chain, understanding what it is that you're being sustainable for. Is it just for the sake of being sustainable, or is there a kind of objective or a rationale that's there, so that you don't fall into the trap of, I'm just going to buy vegan leather because I'm being sustainable. It's about a kind of, you know, what is the purpose behind that, but then looking at, as I say, your supply chain and working with innovative designers. I mean, you know, looking around here today, the amount of kind of independence and innovative products that are here, that getting those used, getting those noticed, and working harder with kind of designers that have honesty and integrity to what they're doing helps you trust and helps kind of build that process.
I think one of the big things for us was actually, and to share that with you, is to minimise waste on your client projects, but also any business that you're running. So with client projects, you know, you're stripping out, for example, a restaurant interior. What's happening to all of that stuff? Work with the contractor, make sure it's not going into landfill. There's lots of companies like Intercorporate, they will resell furniture. It's like the eBay of the hospitality world, for example. There's some really good recycling firms out there. And then you running a design practice, for example, we looked at all the samples we incur for a project. They have a cost, they have a carbon footprint. We give them all back to suppliers at the end of the project, so there's no waste and they can all be reused. Equally, all the packaging we get, we recycle that. There's lots of eBay sellers out there. You can get them on FreeCycle and Gumtree that will take all your packaging. And we're also looking at going paper-free. So as a design practice, it's very hard. We like to draw, we like paper, but we're looking at ways electronically using iPads and Apple Pencils to actually cut down our carbon footprint, what we're doing, and minimising all the waste. And I think the other thing is, recycling's great, but don't start with recycling. That should be one of the last things, kind of end thing that you do. So it's look at reusing, repurposing and repairing, rather than just let's put it in recycling and it goes to waste.
I think these are really good points, and I can only think of one thing to add, which is that if you're just starting out trying to design things in a more sustainable way, set yourself some goals and set yourself some constraints, and not put pressure to do everything at once, because it can be really overwhelming and it can be really confusing. But if you kind of zone in 2 or 3 things and meet those goals, then suddenly it becomes a lot more achievable, and suddenly you can find the time to do that research and really get to know those few points of that project or of that product. And project by project, your knowledge will build up until the point in which suddenly everything you do, you kind of have that knowledge, and you can just, you know, your work is almost cut in half when it comes to doing that research of how to be sustainable within a certain project.
Great. Well, does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask the speakers? No? In which case... Oh, go on. I'll come to you so you've got a mic.
Hi, thanks for all of the comments today. It's been really interesting to hear the changing approaches that I think the last couple of years has generated. I work for a really big textile manufacturer, and obviously you've talked a lot about the things that go onto the furniture and PU leathers, and are they better than real leather, and that's a totally different conversation. One of the things that we did as a company overnight was we shipped probably 50,000 meters of fabric a week, and we changed every plastic wrapping that has to be on the outside to protect it is now recycled in the same way as your carrier bags can be. All of the tubes are recycled cardboard and can be recycled again. But it doesn't have the same message as here's a recycled fabric. The impact of the recycled fabric right now is fairly minimal if a chair's lasting for 7 to 10 years, if a pair of curtains is lasting for 10 years. As designers particularly, where do you sit with that? Because it's a less pretty story to tell, but actually the impact is quite a big step change away from probably where we were a year ago.
It's such a tough question to answer, and I think one of the first things for me, and especially as we spoke, sometimes when you speak with suppliers, it can get a bit daunting, and you don't always get the full story of things. So I usually try to speak with some of the people who actually work in the factory floor to try and get to know that impact, that hidden impact of the product or of the material in this case. Because, for example, if a factory which usually produces or extrudes normal plastic from virgin material gets someone asking them for 5,000 bags that are made out of 50% recycled material, they might not want to have the conversation with that person about it being much easier to either do 100% recycled, but you won't have the same performance of the material, or doing 100% virgin because it's actually going to be more sustainable because of the waste that you are going to produce, trying to tune in the machine to produce those 5,000 bags with 50% recycled material that's probably coming from China. So there's a lot of things like this that don't necessarily get brought up in a boardroom meeting or in a more formal meeting. And it's, to be honest with you, I don't know of the perfect way of telling that story, except to try and be honest and open about it and try and get as much data as possible to inform those decisions. And if you can get information that actually plays to the numbers, then that's great. But it's true, and fabrics are textiles in general are a tricky area because there are a lot of people right now, and there are a lot of companies right now looking into, things with 30% recycled material, for example. You want 30% recycled polyester mixed in with your nylon, and that's actually just making the entire material non-recyclable at the end. So it's about looking at things holistically and also trying to get to the lowdown of it, and being open about that, because solutions aren't always perfect. And I know that there is a demand right now for things that aren't necessarily the most sustainable. But if we can get to the other side of the question and being like, look, here are the numbers. If we produce the way we are producing, here's the impact of it. Here's where our material is coming from, and so on. And if what you want is still a material that is still not natural, but you want to mix materials, or you want, 70% of a natural material, but then you want that added 30% of something recycled, there's inherent waste trying to form that material, trying to make that work, because the chemical components are not the same. And for me, I don't know if everyone feels the same way, but for me, actually having someone with an engineering background or with a chemical background who can come and speak those things to clients seems to be really helpful, because then you get the other perspective of it.
Have any other questions? If not, a quick plug. We're back here in just under an hour to talk about women in design and creating a culture of equality. But in the meantime, if you can join me in saying thank you to Holly, Nicola, and Anna. Thank you.